We're so honored to have Professor Rémi Brague with us today. He's been so patient and so cordial and so generous in our correspondence, but really leading up to this moment to bring great honor to our workshop and to the Hebrew University Institute of Jewish Law. Professor Rémi Brague has a long introduction and bio, so I'll keep it brief. He's Professor Emeritus of Medieval and Arabic Philosophy at the University of Paris, and Romano Guardini Chair Emeritus of Philosophy at Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich. He's been visiting professor in numerous institutions, has given many lectures, recipient of all sorts of awards. I'll just highlight one of them in particular, the 2012 Ratzinger Prize given by Pope Benedict XVI. He's the author of many works. I actually encourage everybody to go visit his website, and you'll just even see from 2020, 2021, remarkably prolific. But let me mention some of his books that, you know, is written in I think written in French and translated to numerous languages, including to English, which is probably most accessible to us. So I'll just mention a few of them. In 2009, a very well-known book about Europe, eccentric culture, a theory of Western civilization. And then he's probably most famous for a trilogy of works written over the last 2 decades. In the English translations, The Wisdom of the World, The Human Experience of the Universe in Western Thought, 2004, The Law of God, The Philosophical History of an Idea, 2007, and The Kingdom of Man, Genesis and Failure of the Modern Project, 2018. I think a recent translation of some essays into English are Curing Mad Truths, Medieval Wisdom for the Modern Age. He's a scholar of Greek thought, of medieval Arabic philosophy, but Judeo-Christian tradition as well. And one of the things that really makes his work so important for everybody and for us is thinking about the ways our heritages and traditions and civilizations inform the present and thinking about hard questions about the future. Today, Professor Brague will speak to us about what is the target of the Mishpat ha-Melek, 1 Samuel 8, and then afterwards, hopefully we'll have time for some discussion. If you have questions or comments, you could raise your virtual hand or you could send me a note in the chat. Professor Brague.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. First of all, I'd like to greet Zeev Harvey. You may remember, Zeev, that I was your Shabbos Goy in Barcelona, in some place like that, many years ago. Well, I'm very proud. It was a great honor to be useful.
The most distinguished and accomplished Shabbos Goy that ever participated in.
Well, since I am no professor emeritus, perhaps I'll be able to get a job as Shabbos Goy. Okay, well, now perhaps slightly more seriously, just a bit more seriously. Well, I'd like simply to give you some sort of a footnote on a very famous pericope on the Mishpat ha-Melek. And I will focus, as a matter of fact, on a single verse. But let me first remind you of the overall framework. Well, there is no king in Israel, so that everybody does what he likes, last words of the book of Judges, or rather, anybody would do what he likes, were it not for the prophet Samuel. Since the latter is already well stricken in years, moreover, since his sons accept bribes, something must change. The people asks for a king in order to be like the other peoples and in order that the king should lead the army. Well, the holy writer has left 2 accounts of the shift from prophetic to kingly rule, so that some sort of dialogue arises, which opened a large space for interpretation. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 8, we read the negative version of the events. The prophet Samuel warns the people about the hardships a king will lay upon Israel. And here is the text in the King James Version. I read it, well, quickly. This will be the manner of the king that shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. And some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains, him, not them, curiously, over thousands, and captains over 50s, and will set them to ear his ground, and to reap his harvest, and to make his instruments of war, and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries, and to be cooks, and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards, and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the 10th of your seed and of your vineyards, and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants, and your goodliest young men and your asses, and put them to his work. He will take the 10th of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day, because of your king, which ye shall have chosen you. And the Lord will not hear you in that day. Well, the passage is well known. It was hotly debated. Was it to be understood as a chart of the legitimate, because divinely vouchsafed rights of kings, or on the contrary, as dissuading the people from letting a king reign over it? In other words, how shall we have to understand the word mishpat? A title of sorts for the passage, a plain description, a value-fraught positive evaluation, bitter irony? That's an open question. Maimonides grounds his exposition of what the king of Israel is expected to receive from his subjects on several verses taken from this passage, which he quotes 8 times. For him, the king has permission, reshut, to levy taxes, and the retinue is forbidden, asur, to refuse to pay them. His decisions are a religious duty, din ha-Melek, din dinar. He can do whatever is described by Samuel, and even what Samuel is silent about, like taking legally wedded wives and concubines too. All this provided he acts for heaven's sake, in order to spread the true religion, to fill the earth with justice, to shatter the might of the wicked, and fight the wars of God. So in the Mishneh Torah and Melachim, Hilchot Melachim Umilchamot. Polemics on the meaning of the passage came to a head at the initial period of the modern state, in its first incarnation as absolute monarchy, especially in England. For thinkers who supported absolute monarchy, the fact that the people of Israel, in the teeth of Samuel's warning, accepted a king, well, that's an argument in favor of the latter's absolute power. Little wonder that Thomas Hobbes should rank among those thinkers. In the present times, the passage is commonly understood as a critique of monarchy. Such a critique is not exceptional in ancient literature, and it even pervades the whole of human history. In ancient folk literature, we have the well-known fable of the frogs, not my fellow countrymen, but the animals. The frogs asking for a king and receiving first a log which doesn't do anything, so that they despise it, then an animal, water snake or stork, depending on the different versions, which eats them up. The fable is to be read in the Greek of Aesop and in the Latin of Phaedrus. In the Bible, there are some passages in which monarchy is criticized. There is, first of all, the famous parable of the trees, told by Yotam on the occasion of the first attempt at a kingly rule in Israel by his brother Abimelech. In the Torah, the institution of kingship is a mere hypothesis, and the possible king is curbed by many limitations. He must belong to the people. He should not have too many women, too many horses, too much money. He should not bring back the people to Egypt. He should study the Torah and even write it with his own hand. In the Middle Ages, we have two people who give a sober and rather jejune account of the origin of monarchical rule. For instance, in the part of the Roman de la Rose, the bulk of it, as a matter of fact, which was written by Jean Chopinel, Jean de Main, between 1268 and 1285. The first ruler, according to Jean de Main, was chosen only because of his bodily strength. A Franciscan friar of the 13th century, Giovanni Fidanza, later known as Saint Bonaventure, even poked fun at the rule which obtained in his time and age, according to which the eldest son of the reigning king should be his legitimate successor. As far as our passage, the letter and precise wording of it has not drawn, to the best of my knowledge, the careful attention of classical Jewish commentators. Rashi, for instance, contents himself with elucidating words in verse 12 and 13. Isaac Abravanel is a glaring exception, perhaps because of his personal experience of political power and the service of kings who alternately and following their whims chose him for minister and forced him into exile. Shortly after 483, Abravanel wrote a commentary on the first prophets, including the books of Samuel. When commenting the institution of a king in Israel, he has a lengthy and rather verbose, which is not unusual with him, critique of monarchy. According to him, a king is not necessary in any polity. He extols the republican regime, exemplified in the Italian city-states like Florence, Genoa, Lucca, Siena, Bologna, or Venice, a city in which he was to end his life. He underlines the advantages of a regime in which the magistrates are elected, remain in office for a short time, have to give account when they leave their position, and don't possess any absolute power. This is still more the case in Israel. Israel need no king, because Israel's king is none other than God himself. In the passage I'm commenting upon, Abravanel contends that the word mishpat is to be taken ironically as a euphemism, seginahor, since one can hardly call justice what trespasses so glaringly the rules of decency. Now, I contend, and this is my thesis, that Abravanel had it wrong, and that the target of the passage is not kingship as a particular form of state power, but state power as such. What does Samuel say to the people? In a nutshell, there will be civil servants, and some among you will have to enter civil service. There will be a standing army, and some of the young people will have to do a stretch as soldiers. There will be taxes, and you will be milked. Such things exist in each and every form of government all over the planet, wherever there is a state. And it has been so since states existed, because no state can stay without those three pillars: taxes, army, civil service. On the other hand, no bare word is uttered on the question, who has the say in the last instance? Who wields the power? How many is he, or how many are there? This was the basic question in ancient theories of the political. See, for instance, Plato, and for that matter, Aristotle, who doesn't depart from his teacher. A commonwealth, a polis, can be run by a single person, by a group, or by the whole body politic. What makes the difference is whether the leading principle, be it one or many, is virtuous, i.e. cares for the common good, or corrupted, i.e. looks for its, the principle, own interest. Moreover, and this is a further surprise, our passage doesn't even ask the question of the moral worth of kingship, i.e. whether the king has a right to do what he does. Hence, by the way, the perplexity of later readers and commentators when it came to assess what the passage was driving at. The fact that the people would regret its choice and cry out leaves open the question whether it has or has not a right to whine and snivel. The very lack of an answer from God is the metaphor of this moral ambiguity. This is what makes this passage unique in ancient literature. Weighing the advantages of the different political regimes is rare, but not exceptional. We have, for instance, in Herodotus's history, a passage in which Persian noblemen discuss about the merits of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. They finally cast their ballot in favor of monarchy and decide to leave the choice of the future king to chance. But they are outdone by Darius's trick with his horse. The fictional character of this narrative need not bother us here. Democracy, isonomie, is defended by a Otanes. He criticizes monarchy because of the danger of arrogance, hubris, in the monarch. His argument resembles very much Lord Acton's famous quip, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What is important is the fact that the question was asked in the framework of a pre-political situation and decided after a careful scrutiny of all drawbacks of each possible regime. But the question of the legitimacy of the state in itself is not asked. On the contrary, it is taken for granted that there must be such a thing as a state. To be sure, in biblical times, the critique of the state could not avoid to prevent itself as a critique of monarchical rule, because no other form of regime was known, generally meaning non-monarchical regimes are rather exceptions than rule in world history. Greek democracies were short-lived. In Athens, slightly more than 1.5 centuries, from Cleisthenes' reforms till the defeat before Philip of Macedonia at the Battle of Chaeronea. Judged by our contemporary standards, they were anyway quite imperfect. In them, the body politic was rather a club of adult males endowed with rights of citizenship, of free condition, and who could even be slave owners. As for Carthago, it was a commercial oligarchy. In the late Middle Ages, some small cities in northern Italy and Switzerland were rather commercial oligarchies too. The only real democracy was Iceland, rather in the sticks. Anyway, in biblical times, the whole Near East was ruled by monarchs. To repeat, I contend that the real target of the passage is rather state power in general and the particular case of monarchical rule. In order to prop my thesis, let me now focus on a single verse of our passage, verse 15. The King James translation has, "And he will take the 10th of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants." The word for seed is zera. According to Gesenius's Hebrew-German dictionary, the word means first the act of sowing, then seed, and for our passage, field, then semen virile, hence the offspring, and finally something like race. The word for officer is saris, which means eunuch. The word has definitely this meaning at the beginning of the third part of Isaiah, a passage to which I will come back. For the context makes it clear that real castrates are meant. Elsewhere, it is a matter of common knowledge that the word, more often than not, simply means a civil servant in general. In some passages, however, it is obvious that real eunuchs are especially fit for some tasks, such as looking after a woman as some sort of chaperone, or after the whole harem of a king, as this is the case in Persia, if we are to trust the book of Esther, in which a eunuch is guardian of the wives, shomer hanashim, and another one guardian of the concubines, shomer apilagshim. As for our passage, the Targum of Jonathan translates the word by prince, Ravrava. Yet the Septuagint translates literally ounukoi. In his commentary, Abravanel doesn't pay any attention to the word saris. He doesn't even reproduce it in his commentary on the passage. Yet he does quote it, but without commenting upon it in his summary before he deals with the text properly speaking. His observation is interesting in itself. The king, by claiming a tithe on the crops, robs the Levites and poor people of what was their due. Yet the word eunuch is not irrelevant. On the contrary, I think, so my thesis, that it plays a crucial role. Let me begin with a historical fact, that civil servants were eunuchs, or if one wants it the other way, the fact that eunuchs were fit for the job of civil servant is a common feature of states, all the more if they are centralized. China is the main example. The Christian churches of before the Protestant Reformation have an analogous phenomenon in the celibacy of priests, although the rule applies differently in the Latin and in the Greek halves of Christendom. In the Latin Church, the Roman Catholic Church, it is extended to priests, whereas in the Greek Church and in the churches which spawned from it, the rule holds good for bishops only. In practice, the Orthodox Church ordains to bishopric only monks, i.e., people who chose to make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God, according to the words of Jesus. Canon Law took advantage of this in the wake of Gratian, who, paraphrasing the gospel verse, puts in Christ's mouth words according to which he likes eunuchs because they deserve the kingdom of heavens. Why is this so? Because an institution like an empire or a church has its own rules, and especially its own relationship to time. A eunuch has no children, hence no nepotism is possible. No new dynasty can be grounded. As a consequence, they depend totally on their master or on the institution they serve and must be entirely devoted to them. Xenophon, the Greek, well, perhaps not necessarily a philosopher, but the Greek writer, Xenophon, explains why eunuchs are so appreciated by sovereigns. The Persian king Cyrus is looking for guards. That's what he tells in his book on the education of Cyrus. Cyrus is looking for guards whom he could trust implicitly, even when he is in dangerous circumstances, like eating, bathing, sleeping, and so on. Quote, Cyrus considered that no man could ever be trustworthy who loved somebody else more than the one who needs to be looked after. Now he knew that those who have children or wives with whom they get on well, or even male loved ones, must naturally love them most. On the other hand, he observed that eunuchs are deprived of all this, and he held that they would think the most of those who are most able to enrich them, to succor them if they happen to commit an injustice, and to bestow honors on them. And he held that nobody could beat him in benefiting them. Furthermore, eunuchs are despised among other people. And for this reason, they need a master who looks after them. For there is no male who could not deem to have in all points an edge over a eunuch, unless some more powerful factor thwarts him. On the other hand, nothing prevents a eunuch from holding the first place if he is faithful to his master. So the Cyropedia in book 7. Well, the rest of Xenophon's reflections, that eunuchs are not less courageous and warlike than other people, need not bother us here. The heart of the matter is that eunuchs, since they lack other enticements, will be compelled to put above all other pursuits the well-being of whom or of what they serve. And now I come to my philological coup, to my philological putsch. I translate the verse 8:15, or rather, I will quite consciously over-translate it by taking the words overly literally as some sort of unacknowledged vowel, like a Freudian slip. He will take your semen and give it to eunuchs. He will take your semen and give it to eunuchs. Here, two types of time are implicitly pitted against one another. There is, on the one hand, the natural time of fields and vineyards, the rhythm of which is dictated by the succession of natural seasons or of the kind of weather they bring about. Seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, to quote Genesis. Fields and vineyards depend on phenomena that belong to cyclical time and require patience. Hesiod's works and days are the best witness to the attitude required of the peasant. There is, on the other hand, the time of files, the time of reports, the time of chronicles, which is the time of the state. This most artificial time is barren devoid of any inner fruitfulness. Hence, it must borrow this fruitfulness from the outside. And this is precisely what is told in our verse. Natural fecundity is taken away and given to the other artificial kind of time. The verse captures exactly what happens when one shifts from pre-statal societies to states. The verse, such I have misinterpreted it. The state appears, when seen from the vantage point of a pre or post-statal situation, be this outlook real or dreamt of, the latter being infinitely more probable, as parasitic, as preying on what was later called civil society. This view of the state is to be found in different places and under the pen of modern authors would have hated to be found together dead in a ditch. So Karl Marx, about the state machinery as a tremendous parasitic body, fürchterliche Parasitenkörper, and a parasitic excrescence, Schmarotzer Auswuchs. So in his wake, Lenin. And on the other hand, this image keeps fostering liberal attempts at limiting its power. I could find, probably I never really looked for such quotations. I could find things about the parasitic nature of the state among liberal authors. A passage of the Deutero-Isaiah enables us better to fathom the gap that separates the two types of temporality. Through his prophet, God hurls menaces to King Hezekiah. The Babylonians will come and seize all the treasures of his palace. And he adds, and of thy sons that shall issue from thee, which thou shalt beget, shall they take away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the kings of Babylon. The repetition of the mention about begetting shows how strongly and consciously the opposition of the natural, i.e., begetting as biological phenomenon, and the institutional, which is hardly artificial, was felt by the prophet. We shift from the cyclical time of growth, decay, and reproduction to the linear time of history in which accumulation is of the essence. In our passage, natural fecundity is taken and given to another kind of time, the time of the state, and as a consequence, the time of its servants. This time is infinitely open, so that no coming back is possible. Hence the basic principle of the non-retroactivity of laws, which was already implied in the nulla poena sine lege praevia, no punishment if there is no, if no law already obtains. Hence, paradoxical decisions, which leave the ground of sound legal reasoning, but are very much in keeping with the inner logic of state temporality. Such are nowadays some laws solemnly declared to be like one-way ratchets because they are supposed to embody a progress. Interestingly, such laws deal with human reproduction, chemical contraception, abortion, ART, surrogacy. Interestingly, too, they consecrate the triumph of the artificial over against the natural. Among these kind of laws, pride of place or shame of place should be awarded to the far earlier decision of the French Parliament in 1884, according to which the Republican form of government was and would remain forever the political regime of France, as if a choice made at a definite point of time could prejudge what will happen in the future, thereby precluding the free decision of later generations. This time, the time of the state, is made possible by the technique of writing, which, as is well known, is the twin brother of the state. Both were born approximately 3 millenniums before Christ. Plato saw the link between writing and sowing when he compared the writer to a peasant who sows seeds into an Adonis garden, whereas the philosopher sows his thoughts into the soul of his disciples. And on this link, Jacques Derrida has shed some original light. Eunuchs are especially fit for the profession of scribe. As is well known, however, the Torah excludes from the community of Israel the males whose testicles were crushed and whose penis was cut off, in Deuteronomy. Maimonides adds to the teachings of the Talmud on this point an explanation. Such a person is not allowed to marry an Israelite woman because he can't beget any offspring, la yumkinuhu an yansula. Hence, such cohabitation would be perverse and futile, nikah fasid wa abath. An answer is given, or a consolation is given in Isaiah 56. Quote, neither let the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus saith the Lord unto the eunuchs that keep my Sabbaths and choose the things that please me and take hold of my covenant. Even unto them will I give in mine house and within my walls a place, Yad, and a name, Shem, better than of sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off, Lo Yikaret. The answer to the eunuchs, to the complaint of the eunuchs, is given through words that allude to castration. Some sentences later, for instance, in 57 verse 8, Yad is undoubtedly to be understood as a euphemism for penis. So does the majority of commentators who surmise an influence of the Canaanite Yiddish found in Ugaritic. And in a Qumran document, the word Yad is used in this meaning, without the ghost of a doubt. Moreover, the use of Lo Yikareth echoes the use of the verb karath as a technical term for castration. For eunuchs who can't be circumcised any longer, the sign of the covenant can't possibly consist in circumcision, Berith Milah. Hence, this sign must be found elsewhere. Now, interestingly, here too, the salvation of eunuchs, or at least the condition which enables them to be integrated into the community of Israel, has something to do with time, i.e., with the dimension of being which took a new turn with a shift from the natural temporality of vegetable growth to the artificial temporality of political institutions. Natural fecundity is replaced by the Shabbat, the day in which no work is allowed, so that nothing can be produced. observing the Sabbath is a way implicitly to bid farewell to the continuous time of state institutions. What transcends natural time is either the state or the Torah. And again, a passage, I will finish with that. Again, a passage from the Greek Bible implies the same teaching out of the wisdom of Solomon. The eunuch who doesn't do something against the law with his hand, en keiri, will receive grace. And here too, this is what I surmise. I feel this in my bones. I couldn't demonstrate it. For the Greek writing Jew, probably from Alexandria, who penned this meditation about 50 before Christian era, the word keir, hand, might echo the pun on yad, which I spotted in Isaiah, although in the Hebrew translation made by Menachem Stein, the Greek word is rendered by kaf, however. Well, thank you so much for your attention. 3/4 of an hour, slightly less perhaps.
Thank you so much, Professor Brague, for
You're
fascinating.
welcome. Oh, hi, Guy.
We have time now for a lot of time for discussion. I think it was such a rich presentation, so there's a lot to think about. Please raise your hands if you want to comment. Maybe I'll just start things off. So actually, let's start off with Professor Harvey, even better.
Hi there.
Okay, thank you very much for the excellent and very suggestive presentation. By the way, I don't remember that story about about your serving as a Shabbos goy, but I do remember on at least one or two occasions at philosophical conferences where you were counted in a minion.
You couldn't open the door of your room in a hotel in Vic or some place like that in Catalonia.
Right. Okay.
It was Shabbos.
Yes. Okay. I have just one question, which is not about your fascinating discussion of eunuchs, but about the earlier part of the talk, where you say that the text is speaking about government in general and not the monarchy, and you say the whole Mid-East was run by monarchs, and nobody knew any other system. And therefore, it's speaking about politics in general, government in general, which is, however, Samuel seems to be distinguishing between the rule of the monarch, or the rule that will take place after Saul, and the rule of the judges that is existing at present. And for a Barbanel, that's a very big distinction, the distinction between the rule of the judges and the rule of the kings. And certainly in modern Jewish political thought, under the influence of Buber, the distinction between the rule of the judges and the rule of the kings is very basic. So how do you understand them? Was the rule of the judges also some kind of a monarchy, or?
Well, perhaps I should have qualified my statement about the fact that the whole Near East was monarchically ruled, where there were systems in which there was some kind of oligarchy. The Seranim of the Philistines might have been some sort of collective power. And as for the judges, well, the very word shofet reminds one of the rulers of Carthago, the Sophites, or I don't know how this is to be pronounced. Well, anyway, it looks like that the judges were considered, at least by the author of the book, by this title, as wielding some kind of solitary power, but a power that was given immediately by God. That's the way. I'm not alluding to real history about which we know precious little thing, but about the way in which the author looks at things. And well, the shift, I alluded to Abimelech's attempt at grounding some sort of monarchy. That's the way modern historians interpret his story, at least. Well, this is understood, if my memory serves me right, that is understood by the author of the book of Judges as a shift from a God-grounded and God-led monarchy to a merely, well, perhaps secular would be an anachronism in this context, but to a mere human monarchy. But I can see no real traces of a non-monarchical rule at this period of time. Well, you know that some people who studied ancient Mesopotamia imagined that the assembly of the gods in Sumerian mythology might be a trace or a remembrance of a pre-monarchic state of affairs in, well, those Mesopotamian cities. I'm not sure this has a leg to stand on, but this is the limit of my knowledge.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.
I want to ask a question, if it's okay. So on the reading that you're advancing, 1 Samuel 8 is a critique of statehood, basically. And I'm wondering, you know, what is the takeaway of 1 Samuel 8 and then maybe other passages of, is statehood necessarily doomed, or are there ways to overcome the vulnerabilities and deficiencies of statehood? Is the solution, you know, a type of anarchy or kingdom of God, like you just alluded to now, or is there a way to construct a state that succeeds in the eyes of the biblical ideology? If we think about, you know, Isaiah, some of the later Isaiah chapters, when they talk about covenant, well, some of the covenants are Davidic covenants. So it's a covenantal scheme that does imagine not just a monarchy, but a necessary idyllic monarchy that endures. So there does seem to be a way to have a covenantal form of statehood and of monarchy. So would you agree with that, or is that departing? Is that responding? I have a sort of another follow-up question, but I'll leave it at that, and maybe I'll ask.
Well, there are several voices in the Bible. You know, that's a whole choir. I already alluded right at the beginning of my talk to the fact that, let's say, modern interpreters of the Bible elicit out of Samuel two trends, streams, two directions of thought. One which accepts monarchy perhaps as a necessary evil, and one which, well, would like to be able to get rid of it. Whether this would be possible, that's another kettle of fish. Well, if you look, for instance, at the passage from Deuteronomy chapter 17, which I quickly alluded to, I couldn't study it in depth. We have there some sort of attempt at a moderate kind of monarchy who would be totally in the service of God's law. Anarchy is present. Well, the best definition of anarchy, is the last verse of the book of Judges. Everybody did. There was no king in Israel, so everybody did what found grace to his eyes. And this comes right after a horrible story, bloodshed. It's absolutely awful. And for this reason, the writer who penned this last verse probably thought that monarchy was at least a second best, the first best being God's direct rule, which is not that easy to establish. Okay, well, monarchy can be at best a second best, provided the king, take care of, accept some limits, not, as I told you, not too many concubines, not bringing back the people to Israel, not too many horses, because horses, explains Maimonides, are found in Egypt, and this would be, it would be difficult not to yield to the temptation of getting back to Egypt in order to fetch horses from there, and so on and so forth. But, the last answer might be the answer of Flavius Josephus, when he coined the word theocratia, theocracy, which has no derogatory shade of meaning in his mouth or under his pen, but on the contrary, theocracy, theocratia, which is, according to him, neither monarchy nor aristocracy nor democracy nor any of the known political regimes. Theocratia, direct rule by God's law, would be the ideal thing. But there are so many different voices in the Bible that you can hardly, at least I never succeeded in doing that. I never ever tried, I never even tried to reduce them to some common doctrine.
Fair enough. I mean, I guess at one point you made a modern analogy. You started alluding to Marx and other texts, and you talked about statehood as being parasitic.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, do you have in the modern analog, is there a version of the vision of 1 Samuel 8 that would be preferred to statehood? Is there a modern construct of theocratia?
Yes, most unfortunately. Well, there is the Islamic theocracy, the attempt at theocracy. I'm not alluding only to Iran's monarchy, the regime of the government of the mullahs, but I'm thinking of what happened, of what is supposed to, what is dreamt of to have happened when the Prophet Muhammad dictated his will to the first Muslim community. Well, this was supposed to be some kind of theocracy, although the word is not there. Well, I had the cheek, I had the nerve some years ago to write an article in which I contended that no other kind of regime as theocracy is possible, which was, of course, written by an agent provocateur. In order to quote an American expression, to épater le bourgeois. Now, my idea was that either you have a theocracy of the book, or you have God's voice in conscience, which is the last resort. Why do people vote for bills saying this or that. The content of the bills is here irrelevant. I guess that they do that because they find that such bills enable policies to be polities to be run in a just way. And this feeling of justice arises in last resort from conscience, moral conscience. A concept which, according to, what was his name? Leibowitz, Yeshayahu Leibowitz is not exactly Jewish. Anyway, let me try to defend this idea. If conscience is taken seriously as being God's voice, and this is, by the way, what Rousseau implied in his lyrical outburst, conscience, divine instinct, immortal and heavenly voice. That's in his treatise on education, in the Emile, in the confession of the curate at Savoy. Well, there is either the divine rule of conscience or the divine rule of the book. There is an Islamic theocracy, and my highly paradoxical thesis was that any Western regime is theocratic, even if we don't admit that, even if the very idea of a theocracy would be disgusting for us, if we would loathe such an idea. But in fact, if the law does not depend on some principle like which can be characterized for the sake of argument as being divine, as coming from God, I'm afraid legislation has not the leg to stand on.
Yoni.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Brague. Thank you for a wonderful, talk. I want to develop, Professor Fladow's question from a slightly different perspective. One, I think the great virtues of your talk is thinking about the relationship between state power and alternatives from the perspective of temporality, right? Moving on different times. So one of the things I want to get your thoughts about is what would a kind of non-parasitic relationship between kind of state temporality, right, and alternative forms of temporality, right? Because if we don't think about it in terms of temporality, if we think about it kind of in the conventional sense of political power, right? We say, okay, so the state will have less control over people's lives and they'll have more control over their lives. But when we think about it as a clash of temporalities, then it's like harder to say, well, let's expand one sphere and reduce another. There's still these two different ways of organizing time clashing with each other. And I think a really good example of this is to develop, in reference to what you were talking about just a few moments ago, when we look at like modern attempts to impose religious law, not using the term theocracies for a very important reason, right? What you often see is you have content, the religious content of laws, right, in the form and using your ideas, I would suggest the temporality of the state, right? So you have kind of hyper surveillance, you have like the literal kind of cutting up in a modernist sense of like when things are permitted, when things are prohibited, and so on and so forth. So I think that insight of yours is incredibly generative, right? To think about it in terms of temporalities, but then we have to then think about, well, what is the division of relationship? How do we divide up a relationship between different modes of temporality in a more beneficial or more productive way? And some things that look very religious, right? We might realize that this is actually moving and utilizing the temporality of a state to just impose, religiously contentful legislation or norms.
Well, as a matter of fact, the focus of my talk was hardly on power. I chose to single out the concept of temporality because it enabled me to compare more easily, two kinds of, how should I put, perhaps, yes, power would do to some extent as far as natural phenomena like growth are concerned, but only power, meaning the ability to bring into being what was not there before, i.e. generation, begetting kids, letting vegetables or trees or whatnot grow and things. There is power behind that, but not power over a human community of whatever kind. Well, you alluded in your question to quite recent developments in in political, and not only in political, but more in social life. You alluded clearly to the idea, well, clearly, if I understood you right, you alluded to the concept of a surveillance capitalism, Shoshana Zuboff's idea, which sounds rather fruitful, by the way, and we are experiencing this in this time of pandemia, perhaps in a more acute way as normally, as in normal circumstances. Well, the trouble or the problem, that kept me running sort of when I wrote this essay, or the text of my lecture, is the fact that in the present time, there is a tendency on the side of state temporality, this artificial kind of time, to absorb and even to not only to impinge on, but to thwart the possibilities in natural growth. I'm alluding to a very simple phenomenon. The fact that our modern, industrial, and up to a point democratic, let's say democratic, let's be optimistic, our relatively democratic societies don't succeed in replacing their own generations. This points towards the idea that perhaps some kind of time is, the artificial kind of the state, and perhaps the artificial time of the modern form, the most recent, perhaps the postmodern, as the idiom has it at present, kind of temporality, has a tendency to destroy, not only to replace what happened, according to my interpretation of Samuel, to my risky interpretation. According to my interpretation, the time of the state, what I call the state temporality, replaced the natural temporality. But at present, perhaps we've made a step farther, such as the state, the artificial temporality of the state is not only replacing, but destroying, perhaps in the long run, we don't know how long this run will be, and proves thereby to be far more parasitic than what Marx, on the one side, Marx and Lenin on the one side and the ultra liberals on the other side thought. And well, I had the last idea which escaped me. Oh, sorry. Oh yes. Well, it is in the inner logic of parasitism that it destroys the living being on which it preys. If there is too much mistletoe on an oak, well, the oak will die. And perhaps if there is too much artificial temporality, well, natural temporality will die. And this might be why our industrial, democratic, and so on, and secular societies will have populations who are slowly dying out. That's what I feel in my bones. Not that's not that rigorous as a demonstration. That's, as we say, that my little finger told me that.
Thank you very much.
A typically French phrase.
Amy.
I have several questions. The first is, were there any, oh, sorry. Were there any?
I can't see you at present. Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry.
Where are you at present? Oh, yeah. Hi.
I didn't know if it helps if I wave. I'm sorry. I'm not very gifted with technology.
Welcome to the club.
Okay, thank you. I was wondering if there were any ancient critiques of monarchy, not in terms of the political aspect or in terms of the hubris in the element of egoism, but in terms of a rebellion against the god. And one of the things that I found interesting in your book was the focus on the unmediated connection between the people and God, which perhaps is also even reflected in the terminology. You point out how Israel is to be a nation of priests as a noble people, but perhaps the precise choice of the term priests rather than noble indicates that the people themselves are supposed to be the connecting factor. Like it's a reinforcement of this unmediated connection, an unmediated tie between the people and God. And the final aspect is just in terms of the hovering nature of God, and again this lack of mediation, directness. Perhaps is not only you mentioned that in Deuteronomy you have that between the people and the land and God, but even in Numbers there's the connection. The very need to remove the leper and the zab and anyone who's impure out of this conception that the people themselves, the camp itself, is the abode of God, and that God is within the people themselves. So perhaps that also reinforces the idea of this absence of, like the main theme is this absence of mediation between the people and the deity.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, there are several things in your question. I must confess that the acoustics is, okay, lousy, really lousy. Perhaps I'm not sure I have understood everything, each and every word, okay. As far as the ancient critique of monarchy is concerned, well, I must confess, well, shame on me, that I haven't yet read whatever was written since writing was invented till the present time. Sorry, I will do my best in order to catch up, but anyway, you stop laughing, Yaakov. Okay, I'm okay, so serious. Well, curiously, it's rather difficult to find real critiques of monarchy. As far as the critique of state power in general is concerned, I would say the passage of Samuel is, to the best of my knowledge, the only one which exists, the only one. and even the critique of monarchy was strangely done by people who always pulled their punches. I'm thinking of a text from ancient Egypt. I couldn't tell you chapter and verse, but I'm sure to have read this somewhere, not in ancient Egyptian, which I'm ignorant of to my greatest regret and shame. But there is a papyrus, I guess, which was some sort of manifesto against the Pharaoh, And well, you know that the name of the Pharaoh is always preceded by a formula, by a phrase, something like life, health, strength. Okay. In the same way as we say Her Majesty the Queen, or okay, some title like that. And well, this manifesto, this tract against Pharaoh has the phrase. As imagine you would poke fun on well, let's say the Queen of England. Let's say the Queen of England. You would say Her Most Gracious Majesty, the Queen Elizabeth, is a twit. Hardly thinkable. And this is precisely what the author of this tract against Pharaoh. I don't remember the dynasty of things. You may find that. Internet knows. Although I read that in a book, probably in a book by Jan Assmann. I saw that Guy Stromza was there. Jan Assmann is a common friend of ours. Well, be that as it may, I don't know a real critique of monarchy. Barring the passage which I quoted from the French, some sort of epic, Le Roman de la Rose, in which they say where they chose not the most brilliant, not the brightest fellow to be king, but the sturdiest man with big biceps, and some sort of Royal Schwarzenegger. And well, there was another aspect of your question, i.e. the problem of mediation or immediacy. The trouble with people who claim to have immediate access to God is that they are more often than not tempted to consider themselves as gods. And for this reason, although mediation might be an obstacle, might be a veil between the divine and creation, it can some sort function as a buffer which avoids a too immediate contact. This idea is to be found in many places. You know, when my fellow countryman, whom Guy Stromza knew very well too, Emmanuel Levinas, wrote this article on loving the Torah more than God. He might be pleading in favor of some, intelligent, rational use of mediation. The trouble being, there is the flip side to what I've said. People who pretend to be mediators might take might pretend, might claim to be able to say what God had to say, then both extremes are dangerous and must be handled with care.
Benny.
Thank you very much for a very
Oh,
fascinating.
Benny.
Yeah, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation.
Very welcome.
My question or comment is not about the biblical text, but maybe about a modern observation or contemplation following your talk. So you addressed the possible connection between kingship, state, temporality, eunuch, and orchestration, and the saris, and following that, I was thinking, what are your thoughts about the modern phenomena of many modern leaders, mostly in Europe, that are not eunuch or didn't experience medical castration, but chose not to bring children, and we have many examples today. In many states, that the leader prime ministers find that they're replacing family with the state, and is there any connection, or what are your thoughts about this kind of phenomena from the biblical perspective, from this passage perspective?
Oh. Well, I was not waiting for this kind of question, although they are, I won't say that such questions are my constant nightmares, but there's something about that. There's something about that. Well, it might be the case that some form of society, perhaps some thoughts, some ways of thinking, are contrary to the very basic conditions of the furtherance of human life. Well, I'm sorry, I have to extemporize. I'm speaking totally off the cuff. Yeah? As I told you, those questions are for me living issues, but I have not prepared anything on this point, let alone something that could have biblical underpinnings. Okay, no, my idea is that there is a substantial dimension, a biological dimension to human life. It's interesting, by the way, to observe to what extent the adjective biological has become some sort of word of abuse. When you say the biological father, okay, it means he's some sort of underling in the whole story. He's not that important. What is important is a fellow who teaches the young boy how to bind his tie. Okay, that's the real father. That's what we hear. Well, in some circumstances, there may be a grain of truth in that. I'm an orphan myself. I never knew my father, and there were fatherly figures around me, but I'm still feeling the absence. There's a hole in me, sort of, the pursuit of the human adventure, which I find highly interesting, by the way. I would like to watch the next season in the series. Yeah? I mean, the season of human adventure. And it might be the case that the human adventure is made possible by a delicate balance between, let's say that in Marxist terms, a balance between the infrastructure and the superstructure. And there are, circumstances in which the superstructure will not only feeds on praise on the infrastructure, but well, destroys it, plays against it. And well, there is a risk for us to forget the necessities and the how could I put that, the requirements of what is the basis of human life, as we are living beings, as far as I know, and I hope, there's a faint hope that some sort of ecological consciousness could help us, might help us, provided it doesn't take its bearings from the idea according to which man is the worst predator on the surface of the earth, and for this reason things would be better if men would, if human beings, I meant, would simply be done away with and be replaced by the wonderful creativity of nature. The question being, who would find this creativity so wonderful? For which observer? Well, we know that God is not such a fellow, since he said after the sixth day of creation that everything was good, and he said Peru verebu, multiply, and so on. Perhaps the aliens would be satisfied in seeing the beautiful spectacle, beautiful landscape of an earth devoid of any human beings. Well, I'm not that sanguine about this idea. And as far as the causes of what I alluded to, you know, the fact that we are not replacing our generations. People who hand over their pail are not replaced by newcomers, or not enough newcomers. Well, the causes are so diverse, you know, there's a bevy of possible causes. And when you, if you know a historian, well, you know, when you ask a historian, what was the cause of let's say the First World War? Well, if he is badly educated, he will guffaw. Oh, causes. There is no such thing as causes in history, only plots, only narratives. And he is well educated, he will have a fine smile and tell you, well, this is not a question for me. This is a question for philosophers. And one poor philosopher, at least one poor philosopher, my humble self, well, is in a pretty pickle as far as answering this question is concerned. Sorry.
I think we're basically out of time. If anybody else wants to just jump in and make a last quick comment. Any the professors or students, anybody want to? We want to be respectful of your time also, Professor Brague.
Well, I have plenty of time. You know, it's a pleasure to, as Smerdyakov says in Dostoevsky's Brethren Karamazov, it's always a pleasure to discuss with intelligent people, you know, the criminal.
It's really such a treat for us that you agreed to carve out time and to share ideas, both, I think, really a model for our institute. You know, our institute, we're dedicated to ancient texts and their history, but also their genealogy and their import over time, and not to just learn from the past, but to think about how the past informs the present. And
but by the way, David, when you introduced me to your colleagues and students,
yes.
And when you mentioned all my virtues, you forgot to mention humility. Next time.
That's exciting to me, because that means there will be a next time. Professor Brague, you have to come visit us in Jerusalem.
Bashana, and I hope it will be Yerushalayim. not
We hope so
through
too.
this horrible system of video conferences or whatnot. Yeah?
So it's an open invitation, and we want to take you up on it. I think we should all thank Professor Brague for such a special
Well,
90 minutes.
I thank you, as a matter of fact. Yeah?
Thank you very much. And we hope to see you in Jerusalem.
Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much.